Okay, everyone. So we are going to work on chapter 8 today, which is the administrative state. Um, so let me go ahead and share my screen, and that way we can go ahead and get started with that. Um, and so, like I was saying right now, everyone, this chapter, it some people might not find it as interesting because it's kind of, and it is one of the more difficult chapters because it does delve into the confusing nature of uh, Texas state government, and that's going to be one of the themes that we're going to be taking a look at. Which, as you may have probably already figured out already, that Texas might not be the most organized state when it comes to uh, when it comes to the way things operate, or and this chapter is going to definitely highlight that a lot more. So I do want to caution you all that this chapter probably is a little bit confusing. So um, definitely do read this one maybe a little bit closer than maybe some of the other chapters because um, there is a lot of there's also a lot of administrative management theory, which is good because I've taken several public administration classes, and I feel that those graduate classes that I've taken do help when it comes to teaching this chapter, because there is a difference between political science and public administration. Political science, obviously, of course, is looking more like at the institutions, um, not necessarily the everyday actions of the institutions, but like why they're there and what's their, like the purpose and all that. Um, Whereas public administration looks at the nitty gritty. It looks more at like the actual day-to-day operations. So some classes that I've taken, they would, there's like budgeting classes, there's classes on um, management and how to manage employees. You don't really see that in political science because political science is more so like about just looking at the institutions in terms of why they're there and how they got there. But public administration is more like how do we actually manage it? So this chapter is going to be very heavy on public administration. So let me go ahead and share the screen so we can get started here. Okay, let's see. Okay, everyone, sounds good. Okay, so let's go ahead and get over here, and we will go ahead and get started here. Okay, all right. So we're going to start with chapter 8, which deals with the administrative state. Um, so let's take a look at the objectives here really quickly. So by the end of this chapter, you should be able to understand the complexity of the administrative organization in, let's see, I'm sorry, because this thing is over here. It's in Texas, including the plural executive, trace the growth of government. Okay, so um, like I was explaining right now, that the administrative setup in Texas is very complex. And when we get to the judicial chapter, I mean, we looked a little bit at the judicial chapter in chapter 2, but you're going to see that there are some similarities in the judicial chapter when it comes to this confusion, basically where there's what we would call overlapping jurisdiction, where there's different, it's like there's like multiple bosses basically, right? Traditionally, if any of y'all have worked or you probably know, like, you have a direct supervisor and then they have their supervisor and all that stuff. So that's kind of the way uh professional organizations are supposed to operate. And we'll talk later on about where that comes from. Like uh some famous sociologists like Max Weber. We also had Fayol with his administrative management theory. But again, that's not really that too important in terms of the theory. I mean, it is in the chapter, but what I want y'all to focus on more so is the, is how it is today. And so what I'm explaining here with the way the organizational structure in Texas is that it's confusing because there's a lot of different bosses, a lot of different agencies that oversee multiple operations. Um, and there's also boards and commissions along with agencies that share power. Like an example is the Texas Education Agency, um, and the State Board of Education. I'm sorry, I keep forgetting to close my email on that. That's fine. I mean, I don't think that's too distracting. But anyway, But yeah, so we're going to talk about like that's an example of the complexity of the organizational setup in Texas. Trace the growth of government. So again, and in my intro to public administration class, we definitely did discuss this. We discussed how that, with the last pretty much since the turn of the 20th century, we've seen that government has increased. If you go back to like, the 1800s, there wasn't much government. There wasn't any regulation of professions, like Abraham Lincoln, he became an attorney just because he read a bunch of, he studied up himself, right? And he read a bunch of law books. Uh, but it's not so simple like that anymore, right? Now there's more requirements, right? There's, going to law school and passing the state bar exam, all the certifications, getting approved by the Texas Supreme Court. That's an example of how there's a lot more government today. There's a lot more government involvement. And so we're going to talk about why that is. Like, um, that why is government overseeing so many things now, as opposed to like 200 years ago, where government was not overseeing, unless, except for the bare minimum, right? The essentials, right? But now, I mean, you see government everywhere, right? There's all kinds of uh, government agencies and government responsibilities. And so we're going to see how that happened and why that happened. Describe the characteristics of bureaucracy and bureaucratic survival techniques. So again, this is going more so into like like the administrative management theories, and so we're going to take a look at what a bureaucracy is and what their purpose is, and what are some of the pros and cons to it, and how are they able to to keep operating. We'll talk about how that because basically uh, a bureaucracy is composed of non-elected employees, right? So I would be considered part of the STC bureaucracy, because I'm hired, right? I'm hired as an instructor, and so I'd be part of the bureaucracy because I didn't win an election to be in this position, right? So we'll talk about like how bureaucracies tend to be insulated from like from the politics of the everyday life of people. I mean, not that they're always insulated, but they tend to. What I'm trying to say is that it's much more likely that the public is going to take out their political frustrations on elected officials because they can actually vote, right? They can actually get involved in whether that person has a job or not. But when it comes to someone working in an organization, um, that depends on the supervisor. That depends on like the performance reviews, the evaluations. You're not going to have some random person, just walk in and say, you know what, like I don't like that Mr. Gonzalez. I want him fired. Um, obviously, that's that's not to say that people couldn't bring up complaints, but it's not up to the public to ultimately decide the fate of the people within the bureaucracy, right? It goes to like the supervisors and all that stuff. So we'll talk about that also. Evaluate bureaucratic orientation and its effect on the public interest. So yeah, this is similar to what we're talking about here right now. That what is the disposition of the bureaucracy? You know, uh, and how does that affect how the public views the bureaucracy? Does the public view bureaucracy in a favorable or non-favorable light? And I think some of us might have some opinions about that already, right? Because I think some of us have dealt with bureaucracy before. There's this famous, well, I don't know if it's that famous, but I like Family Guy, and there's this there's a scene where they're making fun of the DMV, where you go get your driver's license and how inefficient it is and how confusing it is. So the DMV always gets a lot of blame, um, as they tend to be like the stereotype of bureaucracy, because of a lot of problems that they have, which they have been working on being more efficient and not being so confusing. But I definitely recommend for y'all to watch that Family Guy scene. It's very, very fitting. That's kind of like how I would sum up bureaucracy because yeah, it tends to not have a very popular viewpoint because of the inefficiency and also because of what I was talking about earlier, that the public might not feel that they can do anything about how the bureaucracy operates because the bureaucrats are not elected. So uh, they can't directly do anything about issues that they might have with the bureaucracy. Uh, if they have issues with the bureaucracy, they would have to, it has to be done, it would have to be pursued through like electing. electing state officials, and then it would trickle down. So if, let's say Texans wanted for, like for there to be a Democrat governor, and then that could maybe, trickle down some reforms toward the bureaucracy, but that's that's going to take a long time, and it's not going to be as direct as maybe deciding whether to vote for someone or not. Assess the bureaucracy's accountability to the governor, the legislature, and the public. So we will talk about how the bureaucracy is overseen by state officials, um, but that it's not so straightforward in terms of what these elected officials can do to the bureaucracy, right? There are limits on the governor's power. Like one example of that would be that the governor cannot fire a head of a state agency that the governor did not appoint. Now, that's not really a problem now because Governor Abbott has been in power for many, many years. So there wouldn't be anyone at this point, at least for the major positions, right, that he hasn't appointed by now, right? So, but if, let's say in 2022, let's say Beto O'Rourke had won the governor election, then he would have been limited to what he could have done when it came to, um, if he wanted different heads of state agencies, he would be limited in that because he did not appoint those, they were already there before he got them, right? So, but again, we'll talk about this here within this chapter. Okay. So, okay, let's talk about what bureaucracy is. So, bureaucracy is a type of organization that is characterized by hierarchy, specialization, fixed and official rules, and relative freedom from outside control, right? So, again, if any of you all have worked or, or maybe you have family members that um, have worked, and this is mostly pertaining to the private sector. Not to say that I'm sorry for the public sector, my bad. Not to say that the private sector doesn't also have bureaucratic styles of organization. Um, it's just that they do things a little bit differently because they're a private organization. They don't have to release like public information or anything like that. So for this chapter, we're going to focus on public employees when it comes to bureaucracy, because technically that's who it's really talking about. I'm just saying that there are some similarities in the private sector, but we're talking about here within the public sector. But yeah, so like it says here, characteristics of bureaucracy, and of course, I can definitely talk about this a lot because I have pretty much, for the most part, pretty much all of my jobs have been in the public sector, whether it's been as a former correctional officer, former criminal justice teacher, teacher aide, substitute teacher, and then now professor and also adjunct at other places. Of course, as you can see, it's mostly been in education. Even as a correctional officer, they have a school there, so you could make an argument that also is that I was working in an educational a facility that had educational, But anyway, it is what it is. So the point I'm trying to make is that within bureaucracy, there is a lot of they're run with a top-down approach where you have, the head of an organization at the top, and then it trickles down to the different levels, right? So so let me give you an example, like for STC. Um, so you would have, the college president, and then it goes down to the vice president for academic affairs, and then from there it goes on down to the dean of social behavioral sciences, and then after that is the department chair for political science, and then it's me as as a political science instructor. So you see how there's multiple levels within an organization, and that's just one example. You know, all these organizations are going to have this top-down approach where there's multiple levels. People responsible for for different people and all that. So that's what hierarchy is where you have those different levels. Specialization. Um, so of course, and of course this depends on which bureaucracy you are working in. So, um, and again, and I don't, please don't, please don't think that I'm like being like, narcissistic or like just being very arrogant. It's just that I like to use myself as an example because it's what I know best in terms of, personal experience. So please don't think I'm being like conceited if I'm constantly using myself as an example to explain this. It's just that, because I've been in the bureaucracy I've been working for what, how, like, I've been working for 16 years now, for the state of Texas in different capacities within different agencies and organizations. So I can definitely, so I definitely have some experience when it comes to working within a bureaucracy. But anyway, so the specialization part is so like in my example, of course, my specialization is in teaching political science because I have a master's in it. Um, and depending on the jobs within the organization, they will need some sort of specialization. So whether it's maintenance workers, they're going to have because there's also specific maintenance workers within the maintenance department. So there could be like a plumber, there could be like someone that works with HVAC, and they're going to need those specializations to be able to get the job done. Because if you don't if the AC isn't working and you don't know what to do, then you're not gonna be able to solve the problem. So they do have to have that specialization. There are fixed and official rules, right? There are policies that we have to follow as employees. We just got an email that we have to read through the faculty handbook, and so we just got an email from that yesterday. Um, so we have all of these, official rules that we have to follow, we have to adhere to. uh, Faculty is interesting because we have a faculty handbook and we also have an employee handbook because we're both employees and faculty members. So we have two handbooks that we have to follow, and things like that. And there's also the board procedures that the board puts forth, and relative freedom from outside control. This goes back to what I was explaining right now earlier that um, I don't necessarily have to answer to the public when it comes to um, decisions that I make in terms of how I set up my class. Because I do have what's called academic freedom where I can set up grade weights, I can set up the types of assignments and all that stuff. Um, I don't, it's not like I have to go to like a town hall meeting and the public is going to be scrutinizing me for why I have tests at 40% or something like that, right? Because no one really cares about that anyway, because it's not very visible. But the point is that the public is, now that doesn't mean that public officials should not always try to do their best for the public and to try to keep the public's best interest in mind. That's why I always try to do that. Like when it comes to like, giving you all more time for assignments or if let's say, if I make a mistake, I mean, it happens, we're all human and things like that. We're all dealing with a lot of stress and so I try to be understanding of you all. And of course I want you all to be understanding of me as well. Um, so I definitely do try to keep you all in mind. Like I always say, I like to think of you all as my constituents. I think of my students as my constituents so I am supposed to serve them. That's not to say that decisions in the class aren't like, I still have the final call when it comes to decisions because of course I'm the instructor, but I always try to get input from y'all. I always try to get, see if we can come to like, work something out, right? See what we can do to kind of make things beneficial. And I feel that that's one of the reasons why um, students tend to like taking my classes because I do try to be flexible in that regard. So, but yeah, but do I have to be flexible? No, not necessarily because it's my supervisors and they're the ones. Although colleges, of course, are different because we do have student evaluation, so that is part of. So I guess you could say that is an example of maybe not as much freedom from outside control, but then it's not necessarily outside control. It's outside the organization, because you all aren't employees, but it's not outside of the institution. So maybe it's kind of like a hybrid type of thing. So, but again, that's pretty much in a nutshell what a bureaucracy is. So again, they're responsible for enforcing public policy and translating policy into action. So we talked before that public policy is a series of laws, a series of actions that government takes to kind of build on each other and create a theme for um, you know, what what government wants to accomplish. So if let's say the state legislature passes a law having to do with funding for community colleges, um, that then gets trickled down to like the call or maybe not funding, but like I know. Well, let me give you a better example. So one of the state laws that was passed recently was the elimination of the diversity and equity programs at colleges. So now those are no longer required. So, but the colleges do have the ability to decide for themselves if they still want to. Basically, the offices were abolished, so there are no more offices. But that doesn't mean that the colleges still can't engage in those types of hiring practices. It's just that it doesn't have to be mandatory. So that's an example of how that law then trickles down to the bureaucratic agencies, and then they make their changes. Um, Headed by the chief executive. So, as I mentioned, college president is would be an example of a chief executive within higher education. Whether it's a now, there is a little bit of a difference though in that 2-year colleges have local elected boards. Like some of y'all might be familiar that STC has a school board. Um, but whereas UTRGV does not have a local school board, instead they have a state board, the Board of Regents, which oversees all of the state university systems, like like the A&M system, the UT system, and all that, and um, so they have a board, and that board is not elected. So the local community college boards are elected, but the state boards are appointed by the governor. So again, just giving you all some examples here. Permeates entire government structure. So basically, if you look at any state agency, local agency at the city or county level, federal agencies, you'll see that they are very similar in terms of how they operate when it comes to being set up this way with this top-down approach. You know, Obviously, of course, there's going to be some differences because the job is, normally the differences you'll see is based on what it is that they do. But um, But what's important though is that the way they do their jobs, the way that they work on or try to work on um, organizational needs and all that, that's usually done the same way, where you have that top-down approach with the direct supervisors and the specialization. And there's also potential for potential issues for democratic legitimacy because again, one of the main criticisms of bureaucracy, like we've talked about right now, is the lack of direct public access um, to the bureaucracies in terms of how they do their job. Because again, the what's going to determine if I keep getting renewed every year at STC is not really what the public wants or thinks, right? It's more so what my chair sees, what the dean sees, and of course, and to some extent, what you all, the students, see. So it's kind of a combination of all those. Um, so it's not really like again, and of course, what becomes an issue with this is that because we are taxpayer funded, um, and I could definitely understand, and I could, and I certainly see this as well that, if my tax dollars are going to government, I definitely want to have some input in terms of how those tax dollars are going to be spent. Now, of course, we don't have direct input on that because, of course, we have an elective system, representative democracy, where we elect people and then they make those decisions for us. But that doesn't mean that people still don't disagree with the elected officials, especially in this day and age where everything is just so politicized, like where something like public health is politicized, like it's just everything just gets politicized. It's just it's a very it's a, it, the politics is very, very active right now. And I do understand why it is. There's a lot of issues going on. Um, and so the point is that bureaucracies don't really allow for that type of discussion. It's like I said before, it's not like I have to go to like the SEC board meeting and then the public asks me questions about how I set up my class. Like, that's not something that um, you would typically see for bureaucracies, right? Now, that's not to say that there might not be some people that would want to do that, but it's not really something that's really accepted here. So, okay, anyway, so let's go ahead and continue here. Okay, so let's talk about the state administrative agencies. So we are going to talk about some of the major elected officials that serve within Texas in terms of their roles here. Um, let's take a look at the essential characteristics that cause confusion specifically here in Texas. Now, we mentioned that bureaucratic agencies are supposed to be very straightforward, where you can follow the chain of command very closely. Like I said, STC, I give you all, and that's an example where you can clearly see the chain of command. Um, but some agencies are not that straightforward, especially at the top, in terms of the leadership. There's no uniform organization pattern. Um, which means that different state agencies can look differently depending on the type of agency, which um, again, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it can be confusing. Like, let me give you all another higher education example. So, as you all know, like I do teach at other colleges, and so different colleges will have different administrative setups. Like, it's mostly the same, but at this one college that I also teach at, you know how I mentioned that, it goes, higher up from me, it goes to the chair, and then it goes to the dean. In some colleges, a they have a division chair. So you'll have like the department chair and then a division chair and then the dean. So you'll have like another middle person before, so the chairs don't answer directly to the dean, they answer to the division chair. So like there's a chair for like all the different disciplines, which is technically what the dean does at STC, but I'm not sure why they have it set up that way, where you have that extra. I'm assuming it's to help out with the responsibilities. Like I would definitely see that like in bigger colleges where like with larger departments, I could definitely see where you that would be beneficial to have like an extra administrative role there. But I'm explaining that there are differences even within organizations that are working on the same thing. Text administration has numerous exceptions. Basically that this kind of goes back to like the state constitution where there's so many like specifics here that like dealing with specific agencies, there's amendments to the constitution that deal with like specific agencies. So there are exceptions in terms of how the agencies operate, and how they can be different from each other based on some of these factors. You could even have state law that's very specifically tailored to specific organizations. Um, and yeah, that's kind of a major theme that not all the organizations are as powerful or have as many resources, right? So some state agencies have great power while others are limited, and the number of agencies is impossible to accurately define, because there's a lot of hybrid agencies. There's a lot of um, like I said, the book talks about how the university system, and again, I'm sorry that I'm mostly focusing on higher education hierarchy, but that's what I know best because of my experience. But they were talking about how that the Board of Regents definitely has it tough because they oversee all of the different the state universities. But then there's also like other sub agencies and how some state universities are part of like they're kind of like a hybrid system. It's even difficult to teach because it's just so incredibly complicated. Um, but over here, in terms of examples of how there are some state agencies that have greater power, so you can make an argument that DPS, Texas Department of Public Safety, definitely has a lot of power. That's here in Texas, because of course it is empowered by Governor Greg Abbott because of his border security initiative. So that of course is how do I say it? Um, because that's what Governor Abbott's focusing on, and he has every right to do so because since he's governor, he can decide what he wants, what he would want for the state to focus on. Uh, that explains why DPS definitely has a lot more power and is a lot more visible than some of these other state agencies. Let's take a look at the types of policymakers in state agencies. Okay, so we have elected executives. So obviously, of course, this is your plural executive, like your governor and your lieutenant governor that we've talked about, that we've mentioned before, but we'll also talk about some other ones like the attorney general and the comptroller. Um, you also have appointed executives. So this would be like the TEA director, the Texas Education Agency director, or the director of DPS, right? So basically the heads of the state agencies, and elected commission and elected board. So again, this would be like the State Board of Education and the Texas Railroad Commission. So these are uh, state boards and commissions, statewide groups that are elected, that are elected. And so we'll talk about how some of them are different um, when it comes to like how they're elected. I'll explain that right now here. But yeah, but basically in a nutshell, these are boards that are comprised of elected officials that oversee certain industries. So like for State Board of Education, they oversee K through 12 education, the State Board of Education. Uh, the Board of Regents oversees university, but like I said, the Board of Regents is appointed by the governor, but the State Board of Education is elected. And then of course the Railroad Commission, we'll talk about them, how it's interesting because, and I'll always remember this because my professor for Government 2306 made a big deal about this. His name was Dr. Turk. He recently retired about 10 years ago. He was there at UCHRGV, and he would always make, he would always, he was so funny about how he would say it. He would talk about like, why is why is the Texas Railroad Commission overseeing oil and natural gas? You know, now there's a historical reason for that, but I just always found it interesting because yeah, it's true. Like it's kind of like a head scratcher. Like if you don't know the history, you're gonna be like, what? Like the railroad people, why are they overseeing, you know, the oil industry in Texas? But I'll explain why that is. We also have ex officio boards and commissions, which we mentioned before in the legislative chapter. These, of course, are boards that are comprised of high-ranking officials that already have a high-ranking, office. So we mentioned like the Legislative Budget Board, which is comprised of like, the members of the plural executive, like, the governor, lieutenant governor, as well as the speaker. So the reason it's called ex officio because it's based on their position, right? So only those people can be on those boards because of their current role, and it makes sense, right? Because if they're going to be dealing with uh, the budget and redistricting, then it makes sense that it's being done by, the top ranking people within the state because of how important it is. And then we also have other appointed boards and commissions. Like I mentioned, the Texas Board of Regents is an example. There's all kinds of other boards all over the state. Some deal with some deal with commerce, some deal with the medical field, and there's just all. And of course, these are appointed by the governor. But Texas Board of Regents is usually the most they're probably the most one of the most well-known appointed boards and commissions. Okay, so let's go ahead and continue here. And again, this is a listing here of the agencies. Yeah, we're going to talk about the Secretary of State as well here. That's another one that is part of the state executive that is not elected. They are appointed by the governor. But yeah, you can see all of these other different boards here and things like that. Some of them that I mentioned, but we're going to go over most of this here right now. So okay, oh sorry about that. Okay, so let's go with state administrator. Okay, so let's go with agencies with elected officials. Okay, so excuse me, give me just a moment. Let me just get a drink of water. Hold on. Okay, sorry about that. Because it is a lot of talking. Okay, so let's talk about first the agencies with elected executives. Okay, so again, some of these look very familiar. This is the plural executive here that we have talked about before, but we definitely will go more into detail in terms of what they do. So let me see. I think it does it explain it here a little bit more. No, I guess I'll have to explain it here right now. Okay, so the way that these elected officials, of course, are able to serve at the state level of government, and like I said, these are your highest ranking state executives. These are like the most powerful people in state government in Texas, right? Um, so they are elected via partisan ballots for 4-year terms. So they run as members of political parties. We will talk about political parties in the next unit after we finish this one. Um, but yes, obviously, of course, they are partisan affiliated, and it's usually going to be the two major parties, Republican and Democrat. And of course, as you all know, Republicans are uh, they are winning elections in Texas, so the all of these positions are held by Republicans. 5 elected executives in 2018. Um, Again, like I said, they're all Republican and they're all incumbents, right? Because for the most part, right, that a lot of these um, officials will stay in office for a pretty considerable amount of time. Like a lot of these there's not too many new faces when it comes to um, these elected officials like Dan Patrick's been there for a while. Ken Paxton's been there for a while, and we will talk about his impeachment later on. Um, and of course, we also Glenn Hagar, Comptroller of the Public Accounts, Sid Miller, the Commissioner of Agriculture. George P. Bush, who is in your book, he's actually on the first page. He was the former Commissioner General Land Office, but he ran for Attorney General. So he primaried against Ken Paxton, but didn't end up winning. So, and George P. Bush, of course, last name should be familiar. He's the son of Jeb Bush, the former governor of Florida, uh, and brother to George W. Bush, right? So George P. Bush is the nephew of George W. Bush, the former governor and former president. So um, it makes sense, right? A lot of these a lot of these political families it usually does kind of trickle down. No different than like athletes. Like I know, like I'm noticing now that there's a lot of like particularly like in the NFL, there are a lot of NFL athletes right now playing in the NFL that are sons of athletes that I used to watch back in like the late 90s and early 2000s. I mean, yeah, it's been a generation since then, so it does make sense that they would now be playing, but it's just insane to think about how that is. But anyway, so back on topic. So again, of course, you all familiar with the lieutenant governor in terms of basically being the executive officer within the Texas Senate, and of course, I've mentioned how that's kind of quirky. Uh, I think my professor also talked about that was kind of quirky, right? That that the lieutenant governor is technically part of the state executive, but yet their role is really more legislative. But I think that's an interesting take on federalism, right? Where you share power even within like you share powers between the different branches. I think that's kind of interesting. Attorney General, of course, is the top ranking, like you say, the top ranking law enforcement official, top ranking attorney. Uh, we'll learn more about him when we get to the judicial chapter, but basically what he does, of course, is that he is responsible for representing the state whenever Texas gets sued, which happens more often than you might think, especially when it comes to the federal government. The federal government is always suing Texas or Texas, or vice versa. Texas is always suing the federal government because they just disagree so much, especially when there's like a Democrat in the White House. Texas is going to have like political disagreements with Washington, especially when that happens. And of course they are also another important role that the Attorney General performs is that they're also responsible for giving what are called advisory opinions. What this means is that let's say the legislature is working on a bill, and what they might do is they might contact the Attorney General and they might ask him to review the bill to make sure that it is, that to make sure that it is constitutional, right? To make sure that it doesn't conflict with the Texas Constitution. So they will ask for the Attorney General's advisory opinion on that. Basically, he's either not it's not that he's approving it because it's not up to the Attorney General to decide, to decide. Um, it's not up to him to decide whether it's going to become a law or not, right? He's just giving his legal advice in terms of that, whether, if he believes it's constitutional or not, right? I mean, it could still go through the actual legal process of getting to a state court, or even the federal government could also get involved in it too, because the federal courts can also get involved in state issues. But the point is that the Attorney General will give his educated analysis, so he will give his legal opinion, because again, Attorney General does have to be a practicing attorney. That is a requirement. Interesting fact that Greg Abbott was the former Attorney General of Texas, and then he moved up to governor. So um, that does, and of course, we've also talked about how that the role is the line of succession is that. Uh, we'll talk about that in the next chapter, right? That if anything happens to the governor, then the lieutenant governor is next in line. But yes, right. But that's what the Attorney General is. Also, what's interesting, also, the book doesn't talk about this, but the Attorney General is also responsible for the collection of child support money. I don't know if any of y'all seen that. There's a lot of jobs within the office of the Attorney General, and they're responsible for like collecting child support and enforcing those court orders for like wage garnishment and things like that. Um, okay, and then Comptroller of Public Accounts, basically they are in charge of the money in the state. They are in charge of the finances, making sure that the funds that are allocated to the state agencies that they are being spent the way they're supposed to be, and just keeping track of all the money basically. Commissioner General Land Office is responsible for overseeing the state land. So Texas is one of the few states in the United States where the state owns a lot of their land. Um, we have a few national parks, but for the most part, the land is not, is owned by the state. And so the Commissioner General Land Office is responsible for overseeing that land, overseeing the leasing of that land, and pretty much their what tends to be their main responsibility is the leasing of land, like to oil companies and for the exploration of oil, because of course there's a lot of oil in Texas. So that's usually what tends to take more of their time is to lease out the state, the state land to the oil companies. And of course, for better or for worse, people have different opinions about that. And then of course, Commissioner of Agriculture, of course, very straightforward, is responsible for overseeing the agricultural operations within Texas when it comes to like farms and uh, all kinds of, because there's all kinds of farms. There's ranches, dairy, maybe not so much dairy in Texas. That's more so for up north, but like the beef, the cattle production. There's also tends to be a lot of, especially like in East Texas, there are like chicken factories. So now, of course, there's also the FDA, and the US. No, no, it's the USDA. I'm sorry, the USDA usually also has jurisdiction over, but sometimes they do disagree when it comes to like, um, which that's a whole nother story. In terms of like how the federal government and the states, butt heads when it comes to like some of this regulation. But just remember that the Commissioner of Agriculture is responsible for overseeing uh the state agriculture. They're also all responsible for. I've seen this before where um they also are responsible for ensuring that like that the gasoline that you put like at if you go put gas like at any convenience store to ensure that the number the total that it's showing up on the gas pump that it's accurate because obviously because you can't see uh your car filling up, right, because it's not visible. But so if they're jipping you, like if they're ripping you off, if let's say you paid for $20, let's say you paid like let's say you were supposed to buy 10 gallons of gas, but you only got eight, but you were charged for 10 gallons, then you couldn't contact the Texas Agriculture Commission and they'll investigate that. So that's agencies with elected executives. So agencies with appointed executives. Again, so these are, like I said, members of these agencies that are not elected, they're appointed. So the Secretary of State's office uh, is a great example because it's part of the plural executive, but it's different in that it is appointed. So Governor Abbott does appoint the Secretary of State, and basically they are the top election official. Um, they're also responsible for certifying businesses in Texas. But their main, well, I would say that. So when I say main responsibility, it it does depend because certainly elections you would say are probably the most important responsibility, like in terms of the most visibility. But what they do more so on a day-to-day basis is more so the uh overseeing the industry, like overseeing business and industry in Texas. But let me explain. So certifying elections. So the Secretary of State office is the office that is responsible for certifying all the elections throughout the state. So, and we'll talk later on about how the way elections are conducted in Texas is that they are conducted at the county level where you have an elections department in each county, and they'll be the ones responsible for staffing the polls. What I mean by that is hiring poll workers and setting up locations. And then they're actually conducting the elections, right? They're the ones actually taking the ballots and tallying them. And then they will send that information off to the state. The way it works is that there's an election judge and they're responsible for taking that election total information to this the county election department, and then the county election department will then send those numbers off to the state to the Secretary of State's office. Maintaining records on campaign expenditures. Of course, that's we'll talk about how that if you're going to be running for office in Texas, that you do have to submit campaign reports in terms of how much money you're raising. There are some limits in terms of um, who needs to be like in terms of visibility, like who needs to like the names of the donors. Like there are some restrictions on that, but for the most part, just remember that there are certain reports that they have to submit, and on a pretty regular basis. Keeping the list of lobbyists who register with the state. So we'll talk about lobbying later on in the interest group chapter. But yeah, if you are a lobbyist on behalf of a certain agency or behalf of a certain organization, then you do have to register with the Secretary of State to officially engage in lobbying in the state of Texas, administering the Uniform Commercial Code. Um, so again, this is going more towards business and industry in terms of overseeing the rules that businesses have to follow when it comes to like one example would be um, when the businesses have to submit their sales tax, like the collection of the sales tax from the businesses. So obviously, of course, that has to be sent over to the state, and then some of it is sent to the local governments. Uh, but but that would be covered in the Uniform Commercial Code. Issuing corporate charters here. So again, this is like if people want to start like an LLC, one of these business designations, then they do have to get approval from the Secretary of State's office, as well as publishing the Texas Register, which also has the list of the different businesses within Texas. So as you can see, that the point I'm trying to make is that while overseeing elections is probably their most visible job, you can see that most of their responsibilities deals more with business and industry. So it is kind of like a hybrid job, so to speak. It seems like a very interesting job. It definitely does look pretty interesting. I mean, I wouldn't want to do it because of the pressure of overseeing the elections, but it does seem like it is a varied job, so to speak. Okay, let's take a look at some more of these. Let's take a look at the boards and commissions here. So um, let's take a look at the elected boards here. So two major examples are the Texas Railroad Commission and the State Board of Education. So the Texas Railroad Commission is one of the most influential agencies in the state because of the fact that we have so much oil in the state, and we also have a lot of commerce in the state. So let me explain. So the history behind this is why does the Texas Railroad Commission, why do they oversee oil and natural gas? Well, remember that the railroads were coming to Texas in the second half of the 19th century, like in the 1870s. Um, so the Texas Railroad Commission was created to respond to. Remember how in chapter one we talked about how that the railroads were ripping off people, like when it came to charging exorbitant prices. So for to be able to ship ship items, maybe like ship cattle out to other parts of the country. So then we had the Grange movement that came about in response to try to rein in the corruption of the railroad. So Texas Railroad Commission was created in part to regulate the railroads more closely so that they wouldn't be ripping people off so much when it came to those charging those unfair prices. Uh, but then, of course, in 1901 we have Spindletop, right? So then, of course, oil is discovered in Texas, and so then that becomes the leading industry. And so the instead of creating like a separate, like this is such a Texas thing, like Texas just can't stand like big government. So instead of like creating a separate, like instead of creating like the Texas Oil and Natural Gas Commission, instead they just say, okay, Texas Railroad Commission, you can take over that industry. So that's pretty much in a nutshell why the Railroad Commission is oversees oil and natural gas. And again, and it's not just that. They also oversee a lot, the interstate commerce, when it comes to like overseeing like the trucks. We have a lot of commerce coming through Texas, uh, when it comes to like I know it says my internet connection is unstable. So if you can't hear me, I do apologize for that. But basically, Texas has a lot of industry going in between, right? Because of course we are a pipeline uh, from the United States into Mexico when it comes to sending raw materials and then them being assembled, the raw materials being assembled at the maquiladoras in Mexico, normally like in Monterrey, and then going north on. See, Okay, sorry about that. I think my internet cut out here. My bad. So I was talking about the Railroad Commission. And I know we have a couple of minutes left, so we're almost done here. We're gonna finish up here really quickly. Um, but what I was talking about right now was that the Railroad Commission oversees oil and natural gas, but they also see commerce because we do have a lot of because of NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, we have a lot of these. That's why we have so many trucks going through Texas from all parts of the country. Um, the most common route that they'll go is they'll go like through San Antonio because San Antonio can has I-10 as well as I-35, so they'll converge around San Antonio, and then they'll all go south on I-35 to Laredo, and then they can take the trucks into Mexico to go to the maquiladoras, mostly in Monterrey, because Monterrey is directly connected to Laredo. It's a straight shot from there. So, I don't know if any of y'all have ever gone to Laredo and seen like it is amazing to see like the miles and miles of trucks in both directions going into Mexico and coming from Mexico. It is insane to see that many like 18 wheelers. Like it is just it's insane. So, uh, Texas Railroad Commission also oversees the commerce here. Oh, I'm sorry. It wasn't sharing here. Let me share the screen again. Internet connection is still unstable again. Okay, so hopefully it doesn't cut out too much here. I mean, we might have to stop here anyway. Um, so again, statewide elections for staggered 6-year terms, so they don't all get reelected at the same time. Of course, that's what staggered means. And let's go to the State Board of Education really quickly. So again, the State Board of Education is responsible for um, they are responsible for overseeing K through 12 education, right? So this would be kindergarten all the way to 12th grade in high school, right? So they're not responsible for higher education. They are responsible for uh, regular public education. So 15 members chosen by the voters from districts across the state. So it's not an at-large election where it's just the top 15 vote getters that across the state. Instead, it's based on districts, right? So there's 15 different districts in Texas. So depending on where you live, that'll determine which uh, state board member you're zoned to, right? So depending on where you live, that'll determine and that's why when you get your when you register to vote, and then the county sends you your like election card, it gives you all that information. It's really interesting because it gives you all the information in terms of what your what your congressional district is, like what congressional district you live in, what Texas House district, what Texas Senate district you live in, what State Board of Education district you live in. It is very 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 interesting to see that. But yeah, they are responsible for overseeing state education. That's why, in order to become like a teacher, you do have to get your Texas teaching certificate approved by the State Board of Education. So I do have mine. Uh, if you look up SBEC, if you type in SBEC lookup in Google, it gives you the search engine where you can look that up, and then you can look up the teacher certifications throughout the state. So you can find mine. Mine's in history and criminal justice and special education. There's also ex officio boards and commissions. So again, these are like I said, these are boards that are composed of high-ranking officials that are already there in Austin, and they do tend to have some expertise in the subject at hand, right? So, um, and again, it usually does have something to do with some level of expertise, like, and as you can see, there's also some of these other appointed boards here. So, which these also do require expertise. But my point about the ex officio board is that it's comprised of people that already have a high-ranking position within Austin. So, uh, for these other board appointed boards, they don't have to be in Austin. So major categories would be health, welfare, rehabilitation, education boards, and general executive and administrative departments. So this would be like boards dealing with commerce and industry, very, very specialized. And there are, of course, some of these examples, such as the Public Utility Commission, which is responsible for uh, overseeing the administration of utilities in Texas, and of course, um, they got into big trouble back in February 2021 when we had that winter storm, right? You all are probably familiar with ERCOT. Nobody knew what ERCOT was until after that storm. Now everybody knows, and I think some of them might not be too happy about that, right? That now the public knows about them, But yeah, that of course was a difficult time in the state, and ERCOT was criticized, and and I think some people would say rightfully so. Um, So that, of course, the that's so that's so they work in conjunction with the Public Utility Commission. Um, College Governing Board, of course, like I mentioned, they're responsible for um, overseeing, overseeing, the the colleges in Texas and those administrative decisions. And um, like examples would be like the decision to set tuition rates, and you know how tuition's been rising because of the inflation that's been going on. So they have a lot of those administrative responsibilities. And then the Parks and Wildlife Commission is also interesting because they, of course, are responsible for overseeing all the state parks. And so, me personally, since I started being more active physically in the last couple of years, I've really enjoyed going to state parks, um, especially the Palo Duro over there in Amarillo. That one is amazing. If you haven't gone to see it, I know it's far away, but it is absolutely amazing. If you're ever in that area, definitely do stop by. It is just gorgeous to see. And so the book talks about how that Texans really enjoy their state parks, but they're not being funded adequately. And also Texans like their fishing, right? There's a lot of fishing tournaments because we got a lot of lakes in Texas, right? Especially like you go to like East Texas, there's tons of lakes. Even also in the Dallas area, there's tons of lakes over there. So Texans liked their fishing, but they wouldn't like it as much if it wasn't so cheap, right? To get a fishing license, and of course also of course we also have like the state game wardens that are responsible for um, what they'll do is that they'll like if let's say you're out fishing and then the state park warden goes to speak with you, they'll do an inspection of making sure that you have your fishing permit. And of course, for those of you who have gotten your fishing permits, you also probably know that there are restrictions in terms of the types of fish you can catch, like whether they're in season or not. Whether if they're a certain size, if they're too small, you have to throw them back. Because they're still growing. We also see that like when it comes to like hunting, how the hunting of certain animals is also limited to seasons, right? Like right now we are in the white-winged dove hunting season, and the reason for this is because the reason why the season is right now is because the white-winged doves have finished with their mating. The mating usually happens in starts in the spring and goes into the summer. So now, since they're no longer mating anymore, um, and and there's also been some time for the babies to hatch and to grow to where now they don't need to they don't need their mothers anymore. That now gives the green light for Texans to go and hunt white-winged doves. So they are systematic with that. The seasons are not random. They do make sure that it coincides with those mating patterns to ensure that the population will continue to not decrease, right? Because we don't want the extinction of animals due to overhunting, like we saw with like the passenger pigeon, one of the most famous examples of an American animal that was killed off because of overt hunting. Because back then they weren't studying the mating timing patterns or anything like that. But now, of course, now that we have more scientific knowledge about that, we can now we can create those we can set forth those hunting times to be to not be as damaging. Okay, so it's already time for us to stop here already. So okay, so yeah, and that's a good segue because we can get into like we can get into the more of the administrative management theory next time. Now, like I said, we'll see. Okay, let me stop the share here really quickly. And let me stop the recording.